I remember the moment I realized my husband wasn't just a man but something darker. It was a cold night when I heard him whispering outside, speaking low to the shadows. His words were strange, almost like a chant, and I could only make out bits of what he said. But one thing was clear, he was talking about a deal he'd made. Kofi had always been known in our village as a charming and kind man. We had been married 5 years, and though he could be quiet, I thought I knew him well. He was a farmer, a hard worker, and often came home exhausted. But for months, he'd been acting strange, leaving the house late at night and coming back with a dark look in his eyes. I asked him once where he went, and he'd just smile, saying it was men's business. I figured he was just troubled with work or maybe involved in some gambling or drinking. But I'd begun to worry when his absences grew longer, and a creeping feeling kept me up those nights. I brushed it off, trying to stay out of his business, but that night I couldn't ignore it. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening as his footsteps faded away outside, and before I knew it, I was sleeping on my shawl and sandals, following him into the night. The air was cold, the moon high above casting everything in silver. I stayed far enough behind him to stay hidden, moving quietly over the ground as he crossed the field and headed toward the forest. I started to feel foolish. What did I think I'd find? Maybe he was just meeting friends to drink and joke around. But he didn't go to any of the places he'd go for that. He went deeper, farther into the woods than anyone went at night. After what felt like hours, I saw him stop at a small clearing. I crouched low, staying hidden in the shadows of the trees. Then I saw them, the others. They appeared almost out of nowhere, shuffling in silently, each one dressed in tattered clothes, hoods pulled low over their faces. I counted 5 of them, 6 with Kofi. They formed a circle, and as they began swaying and chanting, I felt a chill creep up my spine. Their voices were strange and low, a language I couldn't understand. I kept my eyes on Kofi. He was holding something in his hand, a small, shimmering charm that caught the moonlight. I squinted, trying to make it out, but I already knew what it was. The charm was a cursed talisman. My grandmother used to tell stories about charms like that, charms that could bring power, wealth, or revenge. But the curse was always blood, and once you made a pact with it, you could never break it. Only the most desperate or wicked would use one. Then, I heard Kofi's voice rise above the others. He held the charm high and promised them riches and power. All he needed, he said, was a life, a sacrifice. The others murmured their approval, nodding their heads, and one of them let out a strange, choked laugh that echoed through the trees. I felt my stomach turn. My husband, the man I thought I knew, was willing to take someone's life for his own gain. I was so frozen in fear that I almost didn't notice when he turned and looked right at me. His eyes, which I once found warm, looked cold, almost empty, like he was barely human. I could feel him staring straight through me, as if he knew I was there all along. I slipped back into the trees, moving as fast as I could without making a sound. My heart pounded in my chest, and when I finally got back to the village, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. I couldn't go back to the house. I couldn't even think straight. I just kept hearing Kofi's voice, promising them power, like he was someone I'd never known. The next few days were a blur. Kofi returned home like nothing had happened, even smiling at me with that charm still in his pocket. I tried to act normal, hoping he hadn't seen me after all, but I couldn't hide the way my hands shook around him. He must have noticed, because he'd give me these strange looks, like he was studying me. That charm would glint whenever he reached for his pocket, and I swear his eyes followed me as I moved around the house. It didn't take long before the village started buzzing with news. First, an old man went missing. Then, a young girl from a neighboring village. Every few days, another person would disappear, and nobody knew why. I watched Kofi's face every time someone mentioned the disappearances. He'd nod along, looking serious, but I knew the truth. I knew he was behind it. One night, I couldn't stand it anymore. I confronted him while we were alone. I asked him what he was doing, why people were missing, and if he was involved. I expected him to deny it, maybe even to be angry. But instead, he just laughed, this low, cold laugh that sent chills through me. He stepped closer and whispered, "People go missing all the time, my dear. You know that. The world is full of dangers." He pulled the charm from his pocket and held it up, letting it catch the firelight. "This is all I need to keep us safe and wealthy. You should be grateful." I felt like I was looking at a stranger. I couldn't even recognize him anymore. I knew right then that I had to leave, or I'd be next. That charm, whatever deal he'd made with it, was poisoning him. It had turned him into something dark, something wicked. That night, I waited until he was asleep, then packed a small bag and slipped out of the house. I left everything behind, taking only what I could carry. I walked through the village, then beyond, into the night, not stopping until I was sure I was far enough that he couldn't follow. I don't know what became of Kofi after that. The rumors about him grew stranger over the years. Some said he vanished into the woods, that the charm claimed him in the end. Others said he wandered from village to village, still looking for a new sacrifice. Sometimes, even now, I feel like he's watching me. When the wind rustles through the trees or the shadows stretch long at dusk, I feel his eyes, cold and empty, somewhere close by. And I know that whatever he became that night, whatever deal he made, will haunt him, and maybe me, for as long as we live.